All right, Alexander, let's take a look at the Russian economy. We haven't done an update with regards to the Russian economy for a while now. And my question to you is, has it collapsed yet? Has the Russian economy collapsed, as we have been hearing? Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union address, the EU State of the Union address thing that they do, she said that the Russians, and she actually said this, she said that the Russians are removing chips from their dishwashers and using them in military stuff and elsewhere. So she was like, the Russians are removing chips from their dishwashers because their industry, she said, is in tatters. Russia's industry is in tatters. To a loud applause, everyone was ecstatic that it's mission accomplished. So is the Russian economy in tatters? Are Russians now having to resort to removing microchips from dishwashers? And if they are doing that, to use those microchips in fighter jets, that's a pretty incredible engineering move, I must say.
Well, I'm not a technical person, but I'm sure you're right, actually. I mean, this is a nonsensical thing. Now, we've had two reports from different people about the state of the Russian economy. One has appeared in CNN, and it's sourced by all sorts of people from within the US government. And they've accepted that the Russian economy has proved very resilient. It stood up to sanctions very well. They're disappointed by the way it's held together. They said that the expectation was that the disconnection from SWIFT and the seizure of the central bank assets would cause the economy to crater. And they are both surprised and disappointed that that hasn't happened. So that's what CNN reports people within the administration are saying. So they don't appear to think the Russian economy has collapsed. Perhaps an even more interesting, or at least perhaps more authoritative view of the state of the Russian economy has come from the Russian central bank, which has just cut interest rates again. And they're now at 7.5%. They were 20%, remember, at the start of March. They've now been steadily reduced. Their interest rates in Russia have been falling, even as in the West they've been rising. Now, the central bank said that the economy is performing better than it expected. The Russian economy is performing better than the central bank expected. That business activity is recovering faster than the central bank expected. They also said that Russian businesses have succeeded in finding replacements for Western imports faster also than the central bank expected. Now, the central bank says that there's going to be a GDP contraction this year of around 4%. The Russian Economics Ministry says that it's going to be only 2%. These are not big contractions. Everybody in Russia acknowledges that prices are actually falling. I'm not talking about inflation falling. I'm talking about prices. The prices of physical goods in the shops have been going down. Now, that's from a high increase in March, but they've been gradually settling backwards. The central bank appears to think that that process is now reaching its end point and that prices are now going to basically settle. But it also expects that inflation, headline inflation figures, are going to start falling significantly in the spring. Now, none of that would be possible. None of that would be happening if the kind of scenario that Ursula von der Leyen is telling us were true, that the Russians were pricing out, chips from washing machines. I mean, that just doesn't make any kind of sense. And by the way, I should also say that both the CNN story, perhaps especially the CNN story, and the central bank's account, they discredit for me conclusively and finally that report that we were seeing a few weeks ago from that Yale University group, who are also telling us, everybody, that, behind the numbers, everything in Russia is really coming apart. Now, why are people like Ursula von der Leyen saying that? Well, the reason they're saying that is because the European economy is actually falling apart. The British economy is falling apart. They have to keep the European public on board with this sanctions war, this attrition war that they're waging against Russia. And the same is true, by the way, in the US. So we have these weird and wonderful stories about the Russians prizing microchips out of washing machines to keep their Sukhoi fighter jets operating. I mean, it's outlandish, it's ludicrous. I'm not an expert on the subject of chips, by the way. Russia imports most of its chips from China and Malaysia. Apparently, those imports have been unaffected. And I understand that if you're talking about military, the kind of chips the military tends to use, they're not the very highest end chips anyway. And as I've discussed in other programs, earlier programs, the Russians almost certainly produce many more chips and more advanced chips than they've been admitting to. And this has probably been going on for some time. And even though it's not something that the Russians like to talk about very much. So that story is nonsense. The story of the Russian economy collapsing is nonsense. We have the central bank saying that things are now well on the way to recovery in Russia, that it's going to be a manageable recession, and even the administration is admitting this. And that's what we're being told by both the American and Russian governments. I think it's time people started to accept it.
Yeah, 4%. One side says 4%, the other ministry says 2%. Split the difference and say 3%.
Exactly.
That's incredible. I mean, it
Yes.
really is incredible that they're going to have a 3% contraction, given the absolutely historic economic sanctions that were placed on Russia.
Yes.
It is absolutely incredible that it's going to be only a 3% contraction. I'm left speechless. Obviously, the collective West, people like van der Leyen and this Yale University report, this Yale report, obviously they're lying to their citizens. They're trying to distract away from their own country's collapse by trying to project some sort of collapse on Russia. They're lying. They are lying to their people, plain and simple, because they're trying to hide the fact that a collapse is coming in their economies, and they don't want people to be prepared for that. I won't even say collapse, for the economic difficulties that they're about to encounter as a result of their boneheaded sanctions that they were championing in February, March. Why, in God's name? And this is a question that is driving me crazy. Not why, how? How does the entire US government, the entire UK government, all of Brussels, this huge blob that employs 50, 100,000 people in Brussels, how do all of these institutions, organizations, think tanks, economic experts, financial experts, the brightest and best from Harvard and Yale and Princeton and everywhere in the world, how do they get the Russian economy so wrong? And how do two guys, and not only us, other people in this space as well, but I'm talking about me and you, how do two guys that sit in their home, laptop, internet connection, understand that the Russian economy is not going to collapse like all of you brainiacs are predicting? I mean, please explain this gigantic disconnect.
Yes. I mean, this is, to be very clear, this is the biggest intelligence and analysis failure that the West has undertaken since the end of the Cold War. I mean, WMD in Iraq is peanuts compared to this. This is a colossal failure of analysis and understanding. But I think the explanations are the same. Straightforwardly, if you came along, if you were a CIA analyst let's say a CIA analyst, or you were working in a Washington or London think tank, or you were working within the Commission, if you came along and you took issue with the argument that, Russia's economy was more than just a gas station, if you actually started to do real research into how the Russian economy works, because of the ideological mindset that is now so strong, you would have been out of a job, or at the very least sidelined very, very quickly. It's ideology that did this. They don't want to accept that Russia actually has a first world economy, which it does. They wanted instead to pretend to themselves that it's a house of cards. All they needed to do is kick on the door, and the whole rotten structure, as they believed, would come tumbling down. Now, I'm quoting a certain German gentleman who made the same mistake about Russia way back in the 40s, but you can see that there's a pattern here. There is a consistent pattern of people making assumptions about, how brittle or chaotic or backward or underdeveloped or inefficient or corrupt or kleptocratic Russia actually is, and that never prepares them for the reality of what they're up against. Because, of course, they're not interested in that. They're interested in the sort of ideological vision of the place that they've developed over many, many years, and which nobody around them is prepared to challenge.
Final question. Would it be a stretch to say that this is even deeper than ideology, in that this is not even globalism, maybe an imperialist mindset, in that the collective West refuses to view Russia, the Russian leadership, and the Russian people, because most of the sanctions are directed at destroying the Russian people, even though the collective West will deny that. They are directly targeting the destruction of the Russian people. Is this a factor of the collective West refusing to see Russian people, Russian society, as equal, as peers? Putin complained about this over the last 8 years of Ukraine, but maybe even further back. He's complained about this speech after speech after speech, that the West refuses to engage with Russia as a peer nation, as a peer society, as a peer culture. And this is a type of ideology that is seeping through with regards to other nations as well. China comes to mind. I don't know if you could say India, perhaps, given the way the U.S. kind of the collective West. I won't say the U.S. to say the collective West kind of approaches India and says either you're with us or you're against us. I mean, I don't want to stretch this too much, but you can see how this imperialism, this mindset, can also be carried over into how the collective West is dealing with other countries as well. Is that too much of a stretch to look at this?
No, it's not. Because
this is a massive failure. This is a failure that's destroying the economies of so many countries in the West.
Absolutely. I don't think it's any kind of stretch at all. I think it is exactly correct. I think it is fully right. And yes, of course, the primary target is Russia. These people have a fixation with Russia, which is morbid and unhealthy and very dangerous. But it does extend to other countries. It extends certainly to China. It extends to India. It extends to all sorts of other places too. And you can see that in a narrative that I'm starting to see, or not a narrative, a warning that you're starting to see, at least I'm starting to see, squirreled away in articles that I'm starting to see appear in some British and American newspapers, which is that if this war of attrition against Russia does not succeed, that will show to the world that the West is not the master that it claimed to be. So therefore, we must persist with it in order to make sure that it does succeed. It's become not exactly existential for us, in the sense that it doesn't mean that our societies will collapse if we call this off, but it means that our pretensions of superiority over others will collapse. And if you're somebody with a globalist mindset, that's every bit as important.
All right. We'll leave it there. theduran.locals.com and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day.